impressive.
Good shot, baby.
The Mandalorian and Grogu are back, and this time the galaxy is in serious trouble. Join Sonu Hub as we review the 2026 movie, uncover the biggest facts, and explore what makes it so exciting. Is this the Star Wars adventure fans have been waiting for? Let's find out. Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu, shown on screen as The Mandalorian and Grogu, is a 2026 American science fiction movie directed by Jon Favreau. He also co-wrote the movie with Dave Filoni and Noah Clore. The film was produced by Lucasfilm and Fairview Entertainment and distributed by Walt Disney Studios Motion Pictures. It is part of the huge Star Wars franchise and continues the story from the Disney Plus TV series The Mandalorian, which originally ran from 2019 to 2023. Pedro Pascal stars as Din Djarin, also known as the Mandalorian. Since the character wears a helmet for most of the time, Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder also helped portray the character on set. The movie also features Jeremy Allen White, Johnny Coyne, Martin Scorsese, and Sigourney Weaver. The story takes place after the fall of the Galactic Empire. In the movie, Din Djarin and his young apprentice Grogu are recruited by the New Republic for an important mission. They are sent to rescue Rota the Hutt, played by Jeremy Allen White, and in return, they will get information about a target they are trying to track down. By February 2023, Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni had already written a fourth season of The Mandalorian. However, production was put on hold because of the Hollywood labor disputes that happened in 2023. During that time, Lucasfilm started taking another look at its plans for the Star Wars franchise. Instead of moving forward with the fourth season right away, the studio decided to focus on making a Mandalorian movie first. The Mandalorian and Grogu was officially announced in January 2024. Jon Favreau was confirmed as the director and also co-wrote the movie with Dave Filoni and Noah Clore. Pedro Pascal also returned to play Din Djarin, bringing his popular character from the TV series to the big screen. Filming started in California by August 2024 and wrapped up by December of the same year. More cast members were announced during and after filming, including the return of several characters from The Mandalorian and other Star Wars projects. Ludwig Göransson, who composed the music for the Mandalorian series, also came back to create the movie score. Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu had its premiere on May 14, 2026. at the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles. The movie was then released in theaters across the United States on May 22. It made around $345 million worldwide, making it the lowest grossing live action Star Wars movie. The film received mixed reactions from critics and audiences. Many critics gave the movie credit for its music and score, but they weren't as impressed with the story, visual effects, and action scenes. Story Din Djarin, the Mandalorian bounty hunter better known as Mando, and his young foundling Grogu are now working with the New Republic. Their job is to track down neo imperial warlords who are still trying to keep the old galactic empire's power alive. After successfully completing a mission, Mando gets a new assignment from New Republic Commander Ward. She wants him to track down a mysterious warlord named Commander Coin. The New Republic has been offered information about Coin's location by the Hutt twins. They are siblings who took over the criminal empire of the late crime boss, Jabba the Hutt. But there's a catch. The twins will only give up the information if Mando rescues Jabba's son and heir Rota from the moon Shakari. As an advance payment for the job, Mando is given a brand new Razor Crest ship. Mando isn't exactly thrilled about the mission, but he agrees to take the job. When he arrives on Shakari, he discovers that Rota has become a popular gladiator who fights inside a massive arena owned by a crime lord named Janu. Rota is tired of living in his famous father's shadow and wants to prove that he can make it on his own. He actually enjoys his life as a fighter and refuses to leave with Mando. Rota tells Mando that his next fight will finally pay off his debt to Janu, which means he'll be free afterward. Mando tracks down Janu and offers to pay for Rota's freedom, but Janu refuses. Instead, Janu plans to make Rota's final battle a deadly Dajaric match. Rota will be forced to keep fighting dangerous monsters until he eventually dies. After learning the truth, Mando goes back to talk to Rota, but Rota doesn't believe anything Mando is saying and calls for the arena's security. Mando is quickly taken down and forced to fight Rota inside the arena himself. Mando defeats Rota but chooses not to kill him. Instead, he surrenders and tells Janu that the fight has already paid off Rota's debt. According to Mando, Janu now has to let Rota go. Janu realizes that his plan has been ruined. He sarcastically tells Mando that Rota is now free to die and then fills the arena with dangerous monsters. Mando and Rota have no choice but to team up and fight the creatures together. During the chaos, Rota destroys the arena's security systems, freeing the surviving monsters. Mando and Rota then make their escape. With help from Zeb Aurelios, Mando and Grogu track Rota down and capture him. Rota then reveals something shocking. He claims that the Hutt twins don't actually want to rescue him. They simply want to get their hands on him so they can kill him and take full control of the Hutt cartel. When Mando explains that he needs to hand Rota over to the twins in exchange for information about Commander Coin, Rota drops another major bombshell. Janu and Commander Coin are actually the same person. Manmo decides to trust Rota. He and Zeb attack Janu's compound, capture him, and bring him back to Commander Ward. Ward takes Janu into custody for questioning, but she warns Mando that the Hutt twins are going to be seriously ticked off because he broke his deal with them and didn't deliver Rota. Mando heads back to Nevarro with Grogu. There he brings in 4 Anzellans to upgrade and modify his Razor Crest. He also helps Rota disappear by arranging for a gun runner to take him somewhere safe. But things don't stay quiet for long. During the night, Mando and one of the Anzellans are captured by the bounty hunter Embo. Embo takes Mando straight to the Hutt twins on Nal Hutta. Grogu and the other Anzellans follow behind them. When Mando is brought before the twins, he discovers that they have already captured Rota. The twins plan to keep Rota alive and torture him for hundreds of years. They want to punish Mando for breaking their deal, so they take off his helmet and throw him into a pool filled with dangerous creatures, including Amanin and a massive dragon snake. Mando manages to defeat the Amanin and recover his helmet. With help from Grogu and the Ancellans, he escapes from the pool. However, during the escape, the giant dragon snake bites him and injects him with deadly venom. Mando can't fit inside the small Anzellan ship, so he decides to stay behind on Nal Hutta. He fights off their pursuers and buys Grogu and the Anzellans enough time to escape. But the venom is quickly taking over and Mando eventually collapses. Grogu refuses to leave him behind. Instead, he stays with Mando and takes care of him. Eventually, Grogu manages to save Mando's life with the help of an antidote made by a friendly fisherman. Once Mando has fully recovered, he makes a bold decision. Instead of running away from Nal Hutta, he decides to go after the Hutt twins. Mando knows that if he simply escapes, the twins will keep hunting him and Grogu anyway. So he figures they might as well take the fight straight to them. Mando and Grogu sneak into the twins' palace using the gunrunner's ship. They battle their way through the twins' army of security droids, but they eventually run into Embo. Mando takes on Embo in a one-on-one duel, while Grogu works on freeing Rota. Once Rota is free, he joins the fight against the twins. During the battle, Rota, the Hutt twins, and Embo all end up falling into the dragon snake's pit. Grogu uses the Force to save Rota, while Embo manages to escape through a tunnel that Grogu created earlier. The Hutt twins, however, aren't so lucky. They are left behind and are eventually eaten alive by the dragon snake. The Anzellans return with Commander Ward and a squadron of New Republic forces. Together, they destroy the Hutt twins' palace and wipe out their army of droids. Commander Ward confirms Mando's suspicions that Janu and the Hutt twins had been secretly working together. After everything that happened, Rota decides to stay behind and work with the New Republic. With the mission finally over, Mando and Grogu leave in their Razor Crest. As they fly away, Mando starts teaching Grogu how to pilot the ship, giving the two of them another new adventure to look forward to. Cast Pedro Pascal as Din Djarin, the Mandalorian. Pedro Pascal plays Din Djarin, better known as the Mandalorian or simply Mando. He's a skilled Mandalorian warrior and an experienced bounty hunter who operates in the outer parts of the galaxy. Most of the time, his face is hidden behind his iconic helmet. According to Pascal, the movie kicks off a brand new chapter for the character after the end of the third season of The Mandalorian in 2023. At the end of that season, Djarin agreed to work with the New Republic. Pascals explained that this new direction gives Mando the chance to use his bounty hunting skills while also doing what he believes is right by helping the good guys. The third season also showed Mando being punished for taking off his helmet, something that goes against the rules of the Mandalorian creed. However, the movie once again shows Mando without his helmet. Director Jon Favreau said this wasn't a decision they made casually. The filmmakers had to balance the story that had already been established with their desire to show more of Pedro Pascal's face. Pascal himself felt that removing Mando's helmet made sense for the story being told in the movie. Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder as the on-set doubles for The Mandalorian. Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder also help portray the Mandalorian on set. They serve as physical doubles for the character during filming. Grogu is the Mandalorian's young foundling and ward. He is an infant from the same mysterious species as the legendary Jedi Master Yoda. Grogu is brought to life using a combination of animatronics and puppetry, with visual effects added to make the character look even more realistic. Producer Kathleen Kennedy has described Grogu as a perfect example of a character who can make audiences feel emotionally connected to him without even needing to speak. His facial expressions, movements, and adorable personality do most of the talking. Jeremy Allen White as Rota the Hutt. Jeremy Allen White plays Rota Hutt, the son of the late crime lord Jabba the Hutt. White provides Rota's voice, with the character speaking both Galactic Basic, which is represented by English, and Huttese. For Rota's voice, White took some inspiration from the way Jabba the Hutt sounded in earlier Star Wars movies and shows. Unlike the older and more traditional Hutts we've seen before, Rota is a much more physical character. He's not just sitting around running a criminal empire. Instead, he actually gets into gladiator style fights and puts himself directly in danger. Jon Favreau compared Rota to Adonis Creed from the Creed movies. Both characters are sons of famous fathers and have to deal with the pressure of living in their dad's shadows while trying to create their own identity. Johnny Coyne as Janu Coyne. Johnny Coyne plays Janu Coyne, a powerful crime lord from Shakari. He is also the leader of a group made up of former Galactic Empire loyalists who are trying to keep the Empire's influence alive. Martin Scorsese as Hugo Durand. Martin Scorsese appears as Hugo Durand, an Ardennian fry cook, Sigourney Weaver as Ward. Sigourney Weaver plays Commander Ward, a colonel and the leader of the New Republic's Adelphi Rangers. Before joining the New Republic, Ward previously served as a pilot for the Rebel Alliance. Steve Blum as Garazeb Zeb Aurelios. Steve Blum returns to voice Garazeb Zeb Aurelios, a New Republic pilot who has appeared in previous Star Wars projects. Zeb helps Mando and Grogu during their mission to track down Rota Embo. The Kuzo bounty hunter Embo also appears in the movie. However, the character does not have any spoken dialogue. The Anzellans, several members of the Anzellan species, also return in the movie. All of them are voiced by Shirley Henderson. The Hutt twins, Jabba, the Hutt's twin cousins, also appear in the story. Their voices are provided by actors who were not publicly identified. Stephen McKinley Henderson as the fisherman. Stephen McKinley Henderson provides the voice of the friendly fisherman who helps create the antidote that saves Mando's life after he is poisoned by the dragon snake. Hamki Madeira as Empire Commander Barrow. Hamki Madeira plays Empire Commander Barrow. Matthew Willig as Hawksbreath. Matthew Willig plays Hawksbreath, one of Commander Coyne's henchmen. The movie also features a few fun appearances from familiar Star Wars faces. Dave Filoni, who co-wrote the movie, and Paul Sun-Hyung Lee briefly appear as New Republic X-Wing pilots Trapper Wolf and Carson Teva. Both actors are returning to characters they've played in previous Star Wars projects. Several directors from the Mandalorian TV series also make quick appearances as New Republic X-Wing pilots. Deborah Chow plays Sash Ketter, Rick Famuyiwa plays Jib Dodge, and Lee Isaac Chung plays Doc Suri. Doc Chung, Lucasfilm's Vice President and Creative Director, as well as the movie's production designer, also appears as New Republic member Lieutenant Blick. Anthony Daniels, the legendary actor who played C-3PO in previous Star Wars movies, makes a voice cameo as an air traffic control droid. With all these returning characters, new faces, surprise appearances, and familiar Star Wars legends, The Mandalorian and Grogu brings together a pretty massive cast while continuing Mando and Grogu's journey across the galaxy. The article already has 0 citations, footnotes, source markers, or reference links. Here it is again completely clean. Pedro Pascal returns as Din Djarin. the Mandalorian bounty hunter whose journey from lone operator to reluctant guardian defined the Disney Plus series that preceded this film. In the movie, Pascal's involvement expands beyond the voice work that often defined his contributions when scheduling conflicts arose during the television run. The production placed greater emphasis on allowing audiences to see the actor's face more frequently, a decision director Jon Favreau described as carefully balanced against the Mandalorian Creed's traditional restrictions on helmet removal. Pascal has spoken about the character's evolution after the events of the third season, noting that Djarin's decision to align with the New Republic opened narrative space for combining established bounty hunter skills with a clearer moral framework. This shift required Pascal to convey both the physical intensity of action sequences and the quieter emotional register of a found family relationship with Grogu. The practical realities of portraying a fully armored warrior remained central to the casting approach. Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder continued in their established roles as on-set doubles and suit performers. Wayne, a veteran of the series, handled many of the performance capture and movement sequences that demanded precise physicality inside the restrictive Beskar armor. Crowder, known for his stunt work and martial arts background, contributed the high-intensity combat choreography that appears throughout the film's set pieces. Their presence allowed Pascal to focus on key on-mask moments and dialogue-heavy scenes while ensuring visual continuity in the helmeted sequences. Production reports indicated that the three performers worked in close coordination, sharing reference footage and movement notes so that the character's posture, gait, and combat style remained consistent across every shot. Grogu himself, the child of Yoda's species, occupies a unique position in the casting conversation. The character is realized through a combination of advanced animatronics, puppetry, and digital augmentation rather than a single human performer. Kathleen Kennedy has emphasized that Grogu's ability to emote without spoken dialogue demanded meticulous attention to eye movement, ear positioning, and subtle facial shifts. The puppetry team refined techniques first developed during the television series, incorporating improved materials that allowed greater expressiveness under the intense lighting conditions of large-scale film sets. Visual effects supervisors integrated digital elements only where practical limitations required them, preserving the tactile presence that audiences had come to associate with the character. This hybrid approach meant that the casting of Grogu involved selecting and training a specialized crew of puppeteers and animatronic operators whose work became as critical as any live-action performance. Jeremy Allen White was announced as the voice of Rota the Hutt, a casting choice that generated significant discussion among fans familiar with the character's earlier appearance as a Huttling in the 2008 Clone Wars film. White's performance required him to deliver lines in both Galactic Basic and Hooties, drawing inspiration from the vocal cadence established for Jabba the Hutt in previous Star Wars productions. Unlike earlier depictions of Hutts as primarily sedentary crime lords, Rota is portrayed as a physically capable gladiator who participates in arena combat. Favreau compared the character's arc to that of Adonis Creed, a figure living in the shadow of a legendary parent and seeking independent identity through physical prowess. White's preparation involved studying the physicality of Hutt movement in existing footage and collaborating with the creature effects team to ensure his vocal performance matched the on-screen puppet and digital character. The decision to cast a high-profile dramatic actor known for intense Grounded performances brought a layer of emotional complexity to a role that could easily have remained purely comedic or monstrous. Sigourney Weaver joined the ensemble as Colonel Ward, a New Republic officer and former Rebel Alliance pilot who now leads the Adelphi Rangers. Weaver's casting marked a notable crossover of a major science fiction icon into the Star Wars universe. Ward serves as Djarine's primary contact within the New Republic hierarchy, assigning the mission that drives the central plot. The character's background as a veteran pilot informed both her authoritative bearing and the personal stakes she brings to the campaign against Imperial remnants. We were prepared by reviewing archival material on Rebel Alliance pilots and working with the costume and prop departments to develop a uniform and flight gear that felt authentic to the post-Empire era while remaining distinct from earlier Resistance designs. Her scenes required a balance of command presence and pragmatic negotiation, particularly in sequences involving the Hutt twins and the recovery of Rota. Production notes highlighted that Weaver's experience with large-scale action filmmaking allowed her to integrate seamlessly into the film's more kinetic set pieces. Johnny Coyne portrays Lord Janu, also known as Janu Coyne, a Shakari crime lord who operates a fighting pit and maintains ties to lingering imperial factions. Coyne's character functions as both antagonist and source of critical intelligence, requiring a performance that shifted between calculated menace and opportunistic pragmatism. The actor's work involved extensive time in prosthetic and makeup applications to achieve the distinctive features of the Shakari species while retaining the ability to deliver nuanced dialogue. Fight choreography for Janu's arena sequences demanded physical commitment, as the character is shown overseeing and occasionally participating in the gladiatorial contests that form a major portion of the film's middle act. Coyne coordinated with the stunt team to ensure that Janu's movements reflected both the character's status as a powerful local figure and the underlying vulnerability that becomes apparent later in the story. Martin Scorsese appears in a voice role as Hugo Durant, an Ardennian fry cook. The casting of the acclaimed director and filmmaker in a supporting voice part generated considerable attention, partly because of Scorsese's long-standing relationship with Favreau and partly because of the unexpected nature of the character. Durant provides a brief but memorable moment of local color on one of the film's planetary locations, offering both comic relief and a small piece of world building. Scorsese recorded his lines in a focus session that emphasized the distinctive speech patterns associated with the Ardennian species while allowing room for the actor's own interpretive choices. The inclusion of such a high-profile figure in a minor role underscored the production's willingness to draw talent from outside the traditional Star Wars roster. Steve Blum reprises his role as the voice of Garazeb, Zeb Aurelius, the Lasat warrior previously seen in Star Wars Rebels and briefly in the third season of The Mandalorian. Blum's return provided continuity for a character who has become a fan favorite across multiple media. Zeeb's involvement in the film includes action sequences that required Blum to match his vocal performance to complex physical stunts performed by the character's on-set double. The actor has spoken in previous interviews about the importance of maintaining consistent vocal characterization across years of appearances, a discipline that proved valuable when the film's post-production schedule demanded rapid turnaround on additional dialogue recording. Shirley Henderson provides the voices for the Anzellan characters, a species previously introduced in The Mandalorian. Henderson's work required her to differentiate multiple small characters within the same scenes, each with slight variations in pitch and cadence. The Anselons appear in sequences involving the modification of the Razor Crest and later in supportive roles during the climax, demanding both technical precision in the recording booth and an understanding of how their voices would interact with the visual puppetry and digital effects. Stephen McKinley Henderson voices Gattori, a fisherman who plays a pivotal role in one of the film's more intimate sequences. Henderson's performance brings a quiet gravity to a character who could have remained purely functional, grounding a moment of vulnerability for the central duo. Hemke Madeira appears as Commander Burrow, an Imperial remnant officer, while Matthew Willig portrays Hawksbury, one of Janu's henchmen. Both actors contributed physical presence and intensity to the antagonistic forces arrayed against Djarin and Grogu. Additional returning faces from the broader Star Wars live-action and animated universes include Paul Sun-Young Lee as Carson Teva and Dave Filoni himself in a cameo as Trapper Wolf, both New Republic X-Wing pilots. Directors Deborah Chow, Rick Famuyiwa and Lee Isaac Chung appear as Sash Keter, Jib Dodger and Doksuri, respectively, continuing a tradition of including key creative personnel in small on-screen roles. Doug Chiang, the film's production designer and Lucasfilm's vice president and creative director, appears as Lieutenant Blick. Anthony Daniels contributes a voice cameo as an air traffic control droid, adding another layer of franchise continuity. The Cuzo bounty hunter Embo appears in a non-speaking capacity, requiring a performer capable of conveying threat and professionalism through movement and physical presence alone. The Hutt twins, previously introduced in the Book of Boba Fett, return with voice work provided by performers whose identities were not publicly detailed in primary cast listings, maintaining a degree of mystery around the characters' exact vocal casting. Casting for the film followed a multi-stage process that began with the formal announcement in January 2024 that Pedro Pascal would reprise his role and Jon Favreau would direct. Subsequent revelations occurred around the start of principal photography in California during the summer of 2024 and continued after filming wrapped in December of that year. Sigourney Weaver's involvement was confirmed publicly while production was underway, generating additional media attention. Jeremy Allen White's casting as Rota was discussed by Favreau in promotional interviews as a deliberate choice intended to bring dramatic weight to a character whose previous screen presence had been limited to a much younger form. The decision to film entirely in California influenced certain casting considerations, particularly for supporting and background roles that could be filled by local talent familiar with the region's extensive film infrastructure. Approximately 54 speaking cast members and 3,500 background extras were involved, requiring coordination across multiple departments to ensure consistency of accent, physical conditioning, and familiarity with the Star Wars aesthetic. Suit performers for various alien species underwent specialized training in movement and prosthetic tolerance, while voice actors for creature characters participated in sessions that combined traditional recording techniques with motion reference footage. Pedro Pascal's preparation for the film included both physical training to maintain the conditioning required for action sequences and detailed discussions with Favreau and Filoni about the character's internal arc. The actor has noted that the opportunity to appear unmasked more frequently allowed him to explore emotional beats that were often limited in the television series by the practical constraints of the helmet. At the same time, the continued use of Wayne and Crowder ensured that the armored Mandalorian remained a fully realized physical presence rather than a purely vocal construct. Jeremy Allen White approached the role of Rota by studying the linguistic and cultural details of Hutt society established across previous films and series. His sessions with the sound design team focused on matching the resonance and pacing of classic Hutt vocalizations while allowing space for the character's individual personality as a fighter seeking independence from his father's legacy. The physical performance of Rota was handled by a combination of large-scale puppetry and digital animation, requiring White to synchronize his vocal work with the movement of the on-screen figure during post-production. Sigourney Weaver's preparation involved research into the organizational structure of the New Republic and the residual tensions left by the Empire's collapse. Her character's history as a rebel pilot informed both her bearing in command scenes and her interactions with Djarin, who operates as an independent contractor rather than a formal military asset. Weaver's experience with complex practical effects and large ensemble casts proved useful during the extended sequences that combine live action performers with creature effects and digital environments. The supporting cast of local leaders, imperial officers, and planetary inhabitants was assembled to provide texture and authenticity to the various locations visited during the story. Actors such as Colin Douglas, Nigel Gibbs, Bahia Haifi, Ajay Mehta, Peter Brightmeyer, Rose Portillo, Joel Stoffer, and Sonny Saito filled roles that required both dramatic commitment and the ability to inhabit the specific cultural details of their respective species or planetary backgrounds. Many of these performers had prior experience in genre television and film, allowing them to adapt quickly to the unique demands of Star Wars production design and dialect coaching. Voice casting for the various alien languages and creature characters followed established Lucasfilm practices, combining professional voice actors with specialized dialect work. Steve Blum's long association with Zeb Orrelios provided continuity, while Shirley Henderson's multi-character Anselon performances demonstrated the range required when a single actor voices an entire group. Stephen McKinley Henderson's contribution as the fisherman added a layer of quiet humanity to a sequence that pivots on themes of survival and loyalty. Cameo appearances by creative personnel served both practical and symbolic purposes. Dave Filoni's on-screen presence as Trapper Wolf reinforced the collaborative relationship between the film's writers and the broader Star Wars storytelling team. The inclusion of series directors in pilot roles paid homage to the television production's history while expanding the on-screen New Republic presence. Doug Chiang's appearance as Lieutenant Blick connected the design vision of the film directly to its narrative world. Anthony Daniels' brief vocal contribution maintained a living link to the original trilogy era. The overall casting strategy reflected a deliberate mixture of returning series regulars, high-profile new additions, franchise veterans, and specialized creature performers. This approach allowed the film to feel both continuous with the television series and distinct as a theatrical event. Pascal's expanded visibility, White's dramatic interpretation of Rota, Weaver's authoritative presence, and the careful continuity provided by Wayne Crowder, Blum, and Henderson formed the core of the ensemble. Supporting players and cameos filled out the galaxy, ensuring that every location and conflict felt populated by characters with their own histories and motivations. Production schedules required careful coordination of principal photography with the availability of key performers. Pascal's commitments outside the Star Wars franchise were accommodated by the continued reliance on suit doubles, while Weaver's and White's schedules were integrated into the California shooting calendar. Voice recording sessions for creature characters occurred both during and after principal photography, allowing flexibility when additional dialogue or tonal adjustments became necessary in the edit. The practical effects and puppetry teams functioned as extensions of the casting process, selecting and training the puppeteers who operated Grogu and the various Hut figures involved the same level of scrutiny applied to on-camera actors. These performers developed intimate knowledge of the characters' emotional ranges and physical vocabularies, enabling consistent performances across long shooting days and multiple camera setups. Digital artists later refined and extended these practical foundations, but the initial casting of the puppetry and animatronic operators established their performance baseline. Dialect and movement coaches worked with the full ensemble to ensure consistency across species and planetary cultures. Actors portraying human and near human characters received guidance on accents appropriate to their characters' backgrounds within the New Republic or Imperial Remnant hierarchies. Performers in heavy prosthetics or full body suits underwent physical conditioning and movement training to maintain character integrity under demanding conditions. Voice actors participated in reference sessions that allowed them to see the practical and digital performances their work would support. The casting of background and featured extras received particular attention because of the film's scale. Scenes set in the Shakari Arena, the Twins Palace on Nal Hutta, and various New Republic facilities required large numbers of costumed performers who could convincingly inhabit the environments. Casting directors selected individuals with prior experience in period or genre productions and provided additional training in the specific physicality and social dynamics of each location. This attention to detail helped create the sense of a lived-in galaxy that has become a hallmark of the Mandalorian storytelling approach. In promotional interviews, Favreau and the principal cast repeatedly returned to the idea that the film's ensemble was designed to support the central relationship between Din Djarin and Grogu while expanding the world around them. Pascal emphasized the collaborative nature of the production, noting the contributions of the suit performers and the puppetry team. White discussed the challenge and opportunity of giving voice to a character previously known primarily through visual design. Weaver spoke about the appeal of entering a franchise with such a rich existing mythology while bringing her own perspective to a new character. The cumulative effect of these casting decisions was an ensemble capable of delivering both the large-scale action expected of a Star Wars theatrical release and the intimate character moments that defined the television series. Returning performers provided continuity and emotional resonance. New additions introduced fresh dynamics and elevated the stakes. Specialized creature and voice talent ensured that the non-human characters remained as fully realized as their human counterparts. Together, these elements formed the foundation of the film's performances and contributed directly to its overall identity within the larger Star Wars canon. Star Wars: The Mandalorian and Grogu 2026 production development and pre-production. The road to a Mandalorian feature film stretches back nearly a decade before cameras ever rolled. In 2017, filmmaker Jon Favreau brought Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy an idea for a Star Wars television series centered on the Mandalorian warrior culture, a corner of the galaxy that had been referenced in the saga films but never fully explored on screen. Around the same period, Dave Filoni, already a key architect of the franchise's animated storytelling through his work as an executive producer on Star Wars, The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, was independently developing his own concept built around Mandalorian characters, drawing on years spent working closely with George Lucas on the animated side of the franchise. Recognizing the overlap between the two pitches, Kennedy encouraged Favreau and Filoni to combine forces, a partnership that produced The Mandalorian, the first live action Star Wars series and the flagship title that launched the Disney Plus streaming platform when it debuted in November 2019. The show's success was immediate, and it created a cultural phenomenon that in some respects operated almost independently of the wider Star Wars machine. The Mandalorian's diminutive companion, introduced simply as the child and nicknamed Baby Yoda by fans, well before his true name Grogu was formally revealed partway through the second season, became one of the most recognizable pop culture figures of the following several years, generating an enormous wave of merchandise, memes, and mainstream media coverage that extended well beyond the traditional Star Wars fan base, brought to life through a combination of animatronics, puppetry, and digital augmentation rather than being rendered as a purely computer generated character. Grogu's tactile, practical construction was frequently credited by critics and audiences alike as a key reason the character felt so believable and emotionally resonant on screen. Producer Kathleen Kennedy later reflected that the character represented an unusually difficult creative challenge, a figure who has to convey deep emotion and forge a genuine connection with audiences. Despite never speaking a word of intelligible dialogue, relying instead on physical performance, sound design, and reactive staging to communicate feeling. Talk of a theatrical spin off began almost as soon as the series proved itself commercially and critically. Walt Disney Studios' chief creative officer at the time, Alan Horn, suggested in November 2019, mere days after the show's premiere, that a film centered on the titular bounty hunter Din Djarin could eventually be developed if the series performed well. The following month, Favreau echoed that sentiment publicly, noting there was a clear opportunity to expand the world of these characters into either theatrical films or additional spin off series. A comment that at the time was widely interpreted as an early signal that Lucasfilm viewed The Mandalorian less as a self contained project and more as the foundation for a broader, interconnected corner of the franchise. Momentum continued to build through the second season, with co-star Giancarlo Esposito remarking in September 2020 that the season was laying the groundwork for considerably deeper storytelling to come in seasons 3 and 4. That October, both Favreau and Pedro Pascal said publicly they would be open to seeing The Mandalorian appear in a feature film. Though Favreau was careful to note he wasn't in any particular rush to make that jump, preferring to let the television storytelling develop on its own timeline first. For several years, the working assumption both inside and outside Lucasfilm was that the Mandalorian story would continue to unfold primarily on the small screen, following the pattern established by the show's first 3 seasons and its interconnected spin offs, including the Book of Boba Fett and Ahsoka. Favreau began writing a fourth season of the series by late May 2022, and by February 2023, he and Filoni had completed a full slate of scripts for that season, positioning the show to resume production later that year. Production on the fourth season was expected to begin that September, but the plan was upended by the 2023 Hollywood labor disputes, the overlapping Writers Guild of America and Screen Actors Guild strikes that halted the vast majority of scripted film and television production across the industry for the better part of the year. That November, in the midst of the disruption, Filoni revealed he had been named Lucasfilm's Chief Creative Officer, a promotion that put him in a direct position to help shape the studio's future slate of films and series at a leadership level rather than purely as a writer and director. It was during this extended period of forced delay that Lucasfilm's calculus around the franchise's next steps shifted in a significant way. Rather than simply resume work on a fourth season, once labor negotiations were resolved and productions across Hollywood began restarting, the studio ultimately decided to redirect the story. Favreau and Filoni had already scripted into a theatrical feature film instead. The project was formally announced in January 2024 under the title The Mandalorian and Grogu, with Favreau confirmed to direct and co-write alongside Filoni and to produce together with Kennedy, Filoni and longtime producer Ian Bryce, whose credits stretch across numerous large-scale blockbuster productions. Writer Noah Clore, who had previously contributed to the spin-off series The Book of Boba Fett and to an episode of The Mandalorian itself, also joined the writing team, bringing additional continuity from the streaming side of the franchise into the film's development. Pedro Pascal marked the announcement now by sharing concept art for the film on social media, a gesture that generated considerable excitement among fans, though at the time it remained genuinely unclear whether he would physically appear on set as Din Djarin, a character whose face is usually obscured by a helmet and who had, on the television series, frequently been portrayed on set by stunt and body doubles, even when Pascal provided the voice, or whether his increasingly busy film and television schedule might limit his involvement primarily to voice work. The announcement carried real significance for the wider franchise beyond the Mandalorian corner of it. Specifically, The Mandalorian and Grogu became the first Star Wars theatrical film to move into active production since 2019 Star Wars. The Rise of Skywalker had closed out the 9-film Skywalker saga, a stretch of several years during which numerous other theatrical Star Wars projects had been announced, developed, and ultimately shelved or indefinitely delayed without ever reaching production. For a period after the January 2024 announcement, there was genuine uncertainty about whether the scripted fourth season would still eventually be produced in some form, with the possibility floated publicly that future Mandalorian storylines could instead continue exclusively through sequel films. If the first proved commercially successful, Favreau later clarified in subsequent interviews that he retained every script written for the abandoned season, but that the film ultimately evolved into what he described as more of its own thing, reshaped substantially by the structural demands of a roughly 2-hour feature rather than a multi-episode television arc that could unfold at a slower pace across many hours of screen time. Journalist James Whitbrook, writing for Gizmodo, noted that the existence of finished scripts for a fourth season did not by itself guarantee the season would ever actually be made, and that if it eventually happened, It remained unclear whether those existing scripts would need to be substantially reworked to account for the events and character arcs established by the film. Favreau later offered considerably more detail about what that abandoned fourth season would have looked like had production proceeded on schedule, describing a story that featured a large ensemble of characters drawn from across the franchise and centered heavily on the return of Grand Admiral Thrawn, the Imperial strategist whose live action debut had already been teased elsewhere in the franchise, tying the season into the broader narrative unfolding across this particular era of Star Wars storytelling. He said the season's outline was also specifically designed to help set up story beats for the second season of Ahsoka, suggesting the abandoned season would have functioned as connective tissue linking multiple corners of the post-return of the Jedi storyline together. Rebuilding the project as a standalone theatrical film forced Favreau to largely start over on the actual script, though he was able to preserve some conceptual elements from the original television conception, including the core narrative through-line of Grogu, formally becoming the Mandalorian's apprentice, a relationship dynamic that had been gradually built up across the show's 3 seasons, along with a handful of smaller references intended to tie into the wider galaxy that had originally been planned for the scrapped season. Favreau also emphasized that the film's narrative was deliberately constructed to be less dependent on close familiarity with the previous 3 seasons of the television show, an effort aimed at making the story more accessible to mainstream moviegoers who may never have watched a single episode of the series but were nonetheless generally aware of Grogu as a cultural phenomenon. Johnny Coyne, an actor who had appeared in the show's third season as the Imperial warlord known as Janu, said in later interviews that he had originally been slated to appear across multiple episodes of the planned fourth season before Favreau instead approached him directly about bringing the character into the film version of the story instead. His casting in the movie was formally confirmed in December 2024 once the production's larger character roster began to take shape. The business side of the production moved forward in parallel with these creative decisions throughout 2024. During a February 2024 earnings call with investors and analysts, Disney CEO Bob Iger indicated the film would likely arrive sometime in 2026 and would effectively kick off a fresh slate of Star Wars theatrical releases following several years without a new entry in cinemas. Discussing the reasoning behind selecting this particular project to relaunch the franchise on the big screen rather than pursuing an entirely new story with new characters, Kennedy explained in a later interview that The Mandalorian's popularity on Disney Plus had already cultivated a substantial built-in audience over 3 seasons, and that she believed younger viewers in particular would embrace the film as their personal entry point into the Star Wars universe without feeling obligated to have absorbed the rest of the sprawling 9-film saga and its accompanying television shows first. Filoni, who would later succeed Kennedy as co-CEO of Lucasfilm, drew an explicit contrast with 2015 Star Wars The Force Awakens, the first Star Wars theatrical film released after a decade-long gap between saga entries. He argued that The Mandalorian and Grogu didn't carry the same enormous weight of audience and industry expectation that had surrounded The Force Awakens, since this new film wasn't tasked with launching an entirely new trilogy or introducing a fresh cast of characters to a skeptical or curious audience. Instead, he framed the film in more celebratory terms, describing it as something closer to a victory lap for characters audiences already knew intimately and loved, rather than a high stakes reintroduction of the franchise to the movie going public. Also in February 2024, the state of California awarded the production $21,755, 0 in tax incentives through its film and television tax credit program, and allocation officials described as one of the largest single awards in the history of that incentive scheme. The award reflected a broader shift in how the production was structured. The film was slated to be shot entirely within California, making it the first Star Wars theatrical production to be based wholly within the state. A notable departure given that prior saga and spin-off films had often been shot substantially or entirely at Pinewood Studios in the United Kingdom. State officials projected the production would generate more than $166 million in qualified production spending and below the line wages for California based crew members, technicians, and support staff, framing the award as a significant win for the state's efforts to compete with other jurisdictions offering their own film production incentives. 2 months later, in April 2024, Disney locked the film into a May 22, 2026 release date, occupying a release slot the studio had previously reserved for an unannounced, untitled Star Wars project without a confirmed story or director attached. Sigourney Weaver's involvement in the production was confirmed to be in active negotiation by May 2024, adding a performer with an extensive science fiction pedigree, including her career-defining role in the Alien franchise, to a production already generating significant industry buzz. The film's overall approach to franchise continuity extended well beyond the writer's room and into virtually every department of the production. Lucasfilm's decision to lean so heavily on personnel who had already spent years working within the specific visual and tonal language of The Mandalorian stood in fairly sharp contrast to the approach taken on some earlier post 2015 Star Wars theatrical releases, several of which had rotated through multiple directors, writers, and creative teams over the course of their development, sometimes with reshoots or last-minute script overhauls resulting from those transitions. By contrast, The Mandalorian and Grogu benefited from a comparatively stable creative pipeline, the same director, the same co-writing partnership, and much of the same below-the-line design leadership carried directly over from 3 full seasons of television work, giving the production a degree of institutional memory about these characters and this corner of the galaxy that a brand new creative team starting from scratch would not have possessed. Behind the camera, the production reassembled several key figures from The Mandalorian's television run, a decision that reinforced the sense of creative continuity between the streaming series and its theatrical follow-up. Production designers Doug Chiang and Andrew L. Jones, both veterans of the series and its various spin-offs, returned to shape the film's overall visual world, working to ensure that planets, ships, costumes, and props felt consistent with what television audiences had already come to recognize. Costume designer Mary Zophres joined the project as well, reuniting with Favreau after having worked together previously on his 2010 film Iron Man 2, bringing an outside collaborator with a strong track record in large-scale studio filmmaking into the otherwise heavily Mandalorian-centric creative team. This overlap in personnel between the streaming series and the feature film was seen by many industry observers as a deliberate strategy on Lucasfilm's part to preserve the specific tone, texture, and visual identity that had made the show popular with audiences in the first place rather than attempting to reinvent the franchise's aesthetic wholesale for its return to theaters. Filming principal photography was originally expected to begin in June 2024 in California, operating for a time under the deliberately nondescript working title Thunder Alley, a common industry practice intended to help mask a high-profile production's true identity from paparazzi, leak hunting fan communities, and competing studios during the shoot. Studio estimates attached to the California tax credit filing projected a shoot lasting approximately 92 days with a substantial physical footprint befitting a major theatrical blockbuster. Roughly 54 credited cast members, as many as 500 background extras cycling through various sets and sequences, and a crew numbering around 500 people working across departments, including construction, costuming, practical effects, camera, and lighting. Cinematographer David Klein, who had previously shot the third season of The Mandalorian for television, returned to serve as director of photography on the film, lending a strong degree of visual continuity between the look of the television series and its cinematic follow-up rather than introducing an entirely new visual language for the story's jump to the big screen. Behind Favreau's main unit, Filoni and Peter Ramsey, who had both directed episodes of the television series during its run, took charge of second unit photography, allowing the production to capture supplementary and action-heavy footage in parallel with the main unit's principal work, a common strategy on effects-heavy productions operating under tight release date pressure. Confirmation that filming was actually underway came in early August 2024, when Favreau and Filoni revealed publicly that production had quietly begun several weeks prior without significant advance notice. That announcement arrived alongside a wave of casting and story reveals timed to generate excitement at Disney's D23 fan convention, the return of Garazeb Zeb Aurelios, a character introduced in the animated series Star Wars Rebels and voiced across multiple projects by Steve Blum, was confirmed for the film, as was the reappearance of the small-statured Ancellan species previously seen briefly in Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, and later given a larger role in The Mandalorian's third season as skilled droid technicians. The production also revealed that a rebuilt version of the Razor Crest, the Mandalorian's signature starship, destroyed during a dramatic sequence in the show's second season, would return in some capacity for the film, a detail that generated considerable excitement among longtime viewers who had followed the ship's arc across the television series. Weaver's casting, previously reported to be in negotiation earlier that spring, was formally confirmed at the end of August 2024, coinciding with press coverage of her career more broadly around that time. Speaking about their overall creative approach to the production during this period, Favreau and Filoni emphasized repeatedly in interviews that while the scale of action, spectacle, and practical effects work available to them on a feature film budget would be significantly larger than anything achievable within the constraints of a television production schedule and budget, they remained committed above all to prioritizing the emotional connection between characters over pure visual bombast for its own sake. This emphasis on practical craftsmanship over purely digital spectacle echoed comments the two filmmakers had made throughout the television series run, during which the show had built a reputation for blending advanced virtual production technology, including the LED wall volume stage system pioneered on the series, with more traditional practical effects. puppetry, and physical sets. A substantial portion of the finished film, reported at around 49 minutes of total runtime, was captured using full-frame IMAX cameras, a format choice intended to maximize image resolution, clarity, and overall immersion for audiences choosing to view the film in premium large format IMAX theaters upon release, and one that reflected a broader industry trend of blockbuster productions shooting significant portions of their runtime natively in the IMAX format rather than simply upscaling standard footage after the fact. Principal photography wrapped by the start of December 2024, closing out a shoot that had stretched across roughly 5 months when accounting for the confirmed early August start date, a relatively brisk turnaround for a visual effects intensive theatrical blockbuster of this scale. Post production with filming complete, the editing process fell to Rachel Goodlett Katz, who had previously cut the third season of The Mandalorian for television and brought that direct familiarity with the character dynamics and established visual rhythms of the franchise to bear on assembling the feature film's final cut. Post-production also became a staging ground for a steady, carefully paced drip of casting reveals that continued for well over a year after cameras stopped rolling, forming part of a broader marketing rhythm that mixed traditional press announcements timed around individual news cycles with high-profile reveals saved specifically for major convention appearances, a strategy increasingly common across the modern blockbuster landscape as studios seek to maintain sustained public interest across a long gap between production wrap and theatrical release. In mid-December 2024, Jeremy Allen White was announced as the actor providing the voice of Rota the Hutt, a character who had first appeared all the way back in the 2008 animated film Star Wars: The Clone Wars, as the infant son of the crime lord Jabba the Hutt, long before ever appearing in live-action form. His casting represented one of the more unexpected creative choices in the entire production, pairing an actor primarily known at that point for prestige television drama work with a CGI Hutt character built around gladiatorial combat and physical performance rather than the more sedentary, menacing presence typically associated with Hutt characters in earlier Star Wars film and television appearances, including Rota's own father. Several months later, at Star Wars Celebration Japan in April 2025, Lucasfilm used a dedicated panel appearance to reveal further casting details to an enthusiastic convention audience. Weaver's role was confirmed at that event to be New Republic Colonel Ward, while Filoni was separately revealed to be reprising a performing role of his own in the film, voicing New Republic pilot Trapper Wolf, a character previously introduced in the Mandalorian television series. The panel featured joint appearances from Favreau, Filoni, Kennedy, Pascal, and Weaver together on stage and was capped, as had become something of a tradition for the franchise's convention presentations, by a stage appearance from an animatronic Grogu puppet, underscoring the franchise's continued institutional reliance on practical creature and puppetry work, even amid a film production with a considerably expanded digital visual effects budget compared to the television series. Additional details about the film's voice cast and specialized effects work continued to surface steadily as the release date drew closer. The official trailer, which debuted in February 2026, confirmed several previously unannounced elements simultaneously. That Steve Blum was indeed reprising his established voice role as Zeb from the character's various animated appearances across multiple Star Wars series. that filmmaker Martin Scorsese had been cast in a supporting voice role as an Armenian shopkeeper character, a casting choice that generated considerable media attention given Scorsese's stature as a filmmaker, generally associated with a very different tradition of cinema. That the Clone Wars era bounty hunter Embo, a fan favorite character who had not previously appeared in live action form, would make his live action debut in the film, and that Jabba the Hutt's twin cousins, supporting characters first introduced in the spin off series, The Book of Boba Fett, would also return for the feature FX House, Tippett Studio, a company with a long and celebrated history in stop motion creature animation stretching back to the earliest era of visual effects work on the original Star Wars trilogy. Decades earlier, contributed dedicated stop motion animation work to specific sequences in the film, deliberately blending older analog animation techniques with the far more advanced digital tools typically associated with a modern studio blockbuster production, a choice consistent with the franchise's stated preference for practical craftsmanship wherever feasible. The post-production period also involved extensive work integrating the film's practical puppetry, animatronics, and stop-motion elements with digitally rendered environments and creatures, a process that Favreau and his FX teams had refined considerably across 3 seasons of television production, but which required additional calibration for the larger canvas and higher resolution expectations of a theatrical IMAX release. Visual effects teams worked to ensure that sequences blending Tippett Studios stop motion creature work with more conventional CGI elements would hold up under the scrutiny of a large theatrical screen in a way that television broadcast and streaming compression might have more easily masked, a technical challenge that reportedly factored into the extended post-production schedule between the December 2024 wrap of principal photography and the film's May 2026 release date roughly a year and a half later. One particularly notable structural choice made during post-production was the decision to give the film traditional opening credits, listing key cast and crew immediately at the start of the runtime, a genuine first for any Star Wars theatrical release, since the mainline saga films have, since the original 1977 film, historically opened directly with the franchise's iconic scrolling text scroll rather than any conventional studio style credit sequence beforehand. Journalist Germain Lucier, writing for Gizmodo, suggested this deliberate stylistic break from decades of franchise convention might carry deeper narrative significance of its own beyond simple novelty, hinting that it could function as a subtle signal that the film was consciously positioning itself somewhat apart from the core numbered saga entries that had come before it, existing in its own distinct corner of the franchise's larger cinematic identity. Music composer Ludwig Göransson, who had scored the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian for television and contributed additional thematic material to its third season without serving as full-time composer on that particular season, was confirmed in September 2025 to be returning to compose the film's complete score, bringing a strong sense of musical continuity to the franchise's identity across its transition from streaming series back to theatrical release. Goranson's earlier work on the original series had already earned wide recognition among both fans and industry observers, including for the now iconic character theme most closely associated with Grogu, a piece of music that had achieved a level of mainstream recognition well beyond typical franchise scoring work, circulating widely on streaming platforms and in fan-made content independent of the show itself. His return to the franchise for the feature film was treated by outlets covering the production as a reassuring sign to longtime fans that the movie would preserve the specific emotional and musical texture they had come to closely associate with the property rather than handing scoring duties to an entirely new composer unfamiliar with the established musical language of the series. Formal scoring sessions for the film took place during the first half of January 2026, held at the historic Fox Studio lot in Los Angeles, a recording location with a long track record of hosting scoring sessions for numerous major studio productions across multiple decades of Hollywood filmmaking. As with prior Star Wars theatrical releases, the finished score for The Mandalorian and Grogu incorporates thematic material originally composed by John Williams for earlier entries in the wider saga, woven carefully alongside Goranson's own newly composed original material, a deliberate blending approach that marketing materials and trailers for the film later drew specific attention to, using the presence of Williams's classic themes as a way of visually and sonically tying the new film back to the broader 9-film saga, even as its story remained largely self-contained. The soundtrack reached the public in carefully staged phases surrounding the film's theatrical rollout, a rollout strategy increasingly common for high-profile franchise film scores in the streaming and vinyl collecting era. A digital album featuring Goranson's complete score was released by Walt Disney Records on May 15, 2026, the day immediately following the film's Los Angeles premiere, allowing audiences who had just attended early screenings to access the music right away. Physical formats followed on a deliberately staggered schedule designed to sustain interest across several additional weeks. A standard 12-inch vinyl pressing, collecting 13 individual cues from the score, was scheduled for release on June 5, while a limited special edition 10-inch vinyl record, pressed in the distinctive physical shape of the Mandalorian's iconic helmet and featuring 2 additional score cues not included on the standard digital or vinyl releases, arrived for purchase on the film's wide theatrical release date of May 22. This tiered rollout, spanning an immediate digital release, a standard vinyl pressing several weeks later, and a novelty-shaped collector's vinyl timed to the theatrical opening itself, mirrored a marketing pattern that has become increasingly common for major franchise scores in recent years, designed to give both casual listeners seeking quick digital access and dedicated collectors seeking a distinctive physical object multiple tailored purchasing options across an extended release window. The score's warm critical reception during the film's own review cycle was consistent with the broader trajectory of Gerenson's career within the franchise, and several critics who otherwise expressed reservations about the finished film's narrative or visual execution nonetheless carved out specific praise for the music, treating it as one of the few elements of the production that carried over the television series identity into the theatrical format without any perceived loss of quality or emotional impact along the way. Released theatrical Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu held its world premiere on May 14, 2026 at the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles, a historic venue with a long-standing associations with major Hollywood premieres, including several previous Star Wars theatrical releases dating back decades. The film then opened wide across the United States on May 22, 2026, presented across a wide range of premium theatrical formats, including IMAX, 3D, 4DX, and ScreenX, In addition to standard flat theatrical presentations, giving exhibitors and moviegoers a broad menu of viewing options for the film's opening weekend and beyond. The marketing campaign leading up to the film's release stretched back nearly 2 full years and unfolded across a carefully sequenced series of staged reveals at major entertainment conventions alongside more traditional forms of paid advertising. The earliest public glimpse of any footage came at Disney's D23 convention in August 2024, shortly after news had broken publicly that filming had already begun. That early footage reportedly featured imagery of AT-AT walkers, snow-covered planetary terrain, and the returning Anzalan characters previously seen in the television series, and was generally very well received by convention attendees eager for any early look at the production. Additional footage was shown that November at D23 Brazil, a satellite version of the larger Disney fan convention, where Favreau and Filoni appeared via a pre-recorded video message sent directly from the film's active production set rather than attending the international event in person. A nod to the fact that filming was still actively underway at the time, a more substantial and formal panel presentation took place at Star Wars Celebration Japan in April 2025, where the film's assembled cast and creative leadership team appeared together on stage in front of a dedicated fan audience. Additional footage and first look photography from the production were unveiled publicly for the first time, and the now customary animatronic Grogu puppet made its expected public appearance to the crowd's evident delight. These convention appearances functioned as key checkpoints in an unusually long promotional runway, allowing Lucasfilm to dole out new information gradually across many months rather than concentrating the entire marketing push into the final weeks before release. The first true teaser trailer for general audiences arrived online in late September 2025, though its release did not go entirely smoothly from a public relations standpoint. The trailer had originally been scheduled to debut roughly a week earlier than it ultimately did, but was repeatedly delayed for reasons that were not initially made clear. A postponement that overlapped uncomfortably with Disney's separate and highly controversial decision around that same period to suspend its ABC late night program Jimmy Kimmel Live amid unrelated political controversy, because the teaser ultimately dropped online before that broader controversy had been fully resolved. A number of fans and media commentators speculated publicly that Disney had timed the trailer's release, whether intentionally or purely coincidentally, in a way that appeared calculated to shift public attention away from the ongoing Kimmel-related backlash the company was facing at the time. Writing for Polygon, Matt Patches argued the teaser should have registered as a major standalone event for the franchise on its own merits, but instead came across as an unconvincing distraction technique, comparing the unfortunate timing to a clumsily executed Jedi mind trick that failed to actually redirect public attention as intended. Other critics focused their attention more specifically on the actual content of the teaser footage itself rather than the surrounding controversy. Andrew Webster of The Verge described the teaser as successfully blending the adventurous spirit associated with the original 1977 through 1983 trilogy of films with the more whimsical, family-friendly charm that had come to define The Mandalorian specifically as a television show, suggesting the footage struck a tonal balance between those two distinct eras of the franchise's identity. Polygon's Michael McWhorter, offering a shorter assessment, felt the teaser promised a particularly heavy dose of action-oriented content once the full film arrived. James Hibbard of The Hollywood Reporter characterized the teaser's overall tone as unusually light-hearted and family-oriented even by the standards of prior Star Wars marketing, noting specifically that the footage centered heavily on Grogu throughout and that aside from a brief glimpse of Weaver, virtually no human faces were shown clearly at any point amid all the creatures, droids, and helmeted characters populating the trailer's various shots. Also writing for The Hollywood Reporter, Richard Newby offered a considerably more skeptical assessment of the marketing strategy on display, arguing that the teaser and the broader early marketing campaign surrounding it had done relatively little to meaningfully differentiate the film from the television series that had originally inspired it, which he felt left open an uncomfortable question about why a full theatrical film had ultimately been prioritized over simply producing a fourth season instead. While Newby made a point of clarifying that he considered himself a genuine fan of the television show on its own terms, he maintained firmly that a theatrical Star Wars release ought to feel meaningfully distinct from the experience of watching a weekly episode of a Disney Plus streaming series at home. The film's marketing campaign took an unusual and widely discussed turn in early February 2026 with the release of a dedicated television spot during Super Bowl LX, one of the most expensive and closely watched advertising windows in all of American media. Rather than releasing a conventional trailer during the broadcast, the studio instead aired a spot depicting Din Djarin and Grogu riding together in a wagon pulled by Tauntauns the shaggy, cold-adapted creatures native to the ice planet Hoth, first seen in The Empire Strikes Back, accompanied by warm, foxy narration from veteran actor Sam Elliott. The advertisement was structured as a direct and fairly overt parody of the long-running Budweiser Super Bowl commercials featuring the company's famous Clydesdale horses, a callback that Lucasfilm's own marketing team described publicly as a creative and affectionate way to pay tribute to a beloved decades-long advertising tradition while simultaneously reinforcing the sense of fun, heart and visual spectacle the studio wanted closely associated with the franchise heading into its theatrical return. The choice to use a Super Bowl window for a parody advertisement rather than a conventional trailer also carried a financial dimension worth noting. Super Bowl advertising slots are consistently among the single most expensive media buys available to any advertiser in the United States, and studios that choose to spend on that window typically do so with the expectation of reaching an enormous, largely non-genre specific audience that a typical trailer drop elsewhere might not capture as efficiently. That the studio opted to use such a costly and high visibility placement on a stylistic parody rather than a more conventional footage driven trailer became in itself a talking point across several of the outlets covering the campaign, feeding directly into the broader debate over whether Lucasfilm's marketing team had correctly read the moment for a franchise attempting to re-establish its theatrical footing. Reception to the Super Bowl spot itself proved decidedly mixed to outright negative among critics and commentators, even as it generated significant conversation. Omar L. Galaga of the Los Angeles Times ranked it ninth on a published list of the best advertisements to air during the broadcast that year, praising the underlying cleverness of mimicking the well-known Budweiser format, even while placing the spot relatively low within his overall ranking of the night's advertising slate. Eric Diaz of Nerdist described the spot in warmer terms as wholesome and thoroughly charming, likening its overall tone and visual sensibility to that of a heartfelt holiday greeting card rather than a typical blockbuster movie trailer. Other outlets, however, were considerably harsher in their assessments. Writers Ryan Scott and Polly Poisuo of the outlet film went so far as to describe it as the weakest Star Wars promotional spot they had personally ever seen released by the studio. While Polygon's Amy Hart wrote that she came away from the spot feeling bored and genuinely disappointed, arguing that Lucasfilm and Disney had squandered an enormously valuable and expensive promotional opportunity on one of the biggest advertising nights of the entire year. James Whitbrook of Gizmodo expressed a somewhat broader sense of confusion about the film's overall marketing strategy at that particular stage of the campaign, observing that the television series had always leaned heavily on general mood and atmosphere rather than explicit plot details in its own promotional materials, and that the film's marketing campaign had remained broadly consistent with that established approach even as it moved into a bigger theatrical context. But he questioned openly whether that same low information strategy still made sense given that this was, after all, the first genuinely new Star Wars theatrical release to hit cinemas in several years. With the film's premiere still several months away at that point in the campaign, Whitbrook argued the marketing rollout had yet to make a fully compelling case to general audiences for why they should specifically choose to see this particular film in a theater, or for that matter, why Lucasfilm hadn't simply proceeded with producing a fourth season of the television series instead of pivoting to a feature film. The tide of critical marketing commentary shifted noticeably with the arrival of the full official trailer in mid February 2026, several months ahead of the film's eventual release. Multiple outlets expressed open and fairly candid relief at finally receiving a substantive detailed look at the film after many months of comparatively vague teasers, stunt driven promotional material, and a widely panned Super Bowl advertisement. Whitbrook, again writing for Gizmodo, noted that while the trailer still withheld a considerable amount of specific plot information from the audience, it nonetheless offered a considerably expanded and more concrete sense of what viewers could actually expect from the finished film compared to everything that had come before it. Commentary and analysis surrounding the trailer tended to converge repeatedly on a handful of specific reveals that generated the most discussion. The confirmation that Din Djarin would remove his helmet on screen at some point in the story, allowing audiences an extended and clear look at Pascal's face, in a way the television series had generally avoided for long stretches. The live action debut of the previously animation only bounty hunter character Embo, and the confirmed casting of filmmaker Martin Scorsese in a small supporting voice role. Discussing the broader cultural significance of Scorsese's involvement specifically, Polygon's Matt Patches suggested the casting choice functioned almost as a symbolic peace offering extended towards skeptics of modern blockbuster filmmaking, given Scorsese's well-documented history of publicly critical comments about franchise cinema and its dominance of the contemporary theatrical marketplace, framing his brief participation in the film as a deliberate attempt by Lucasfilm to find some degree of common ground between more art house oriented cinephile audiences and mainstream blockbuster fans. Promotion continued steadily into the spring with a high profile appearance at CinemaCon the annual industry convention for theater owners and exhibitors held in Las Vegas in April 2026. There, Favreau personally debuted the film's final theatrical trailer for attendees and additionally screened the first 17 minutes of the finished movie directly for the assembled exhibitor audience, with the trailer itself subsequently released to the general public online shortly afterward. Whitbrook described this final trailer as a considerably stronger and more confident showcase for the film than any prior piece of marketing material had managed to be, specifically calling attention to its heavily action-oriented footage and its deliberate incorporation of John Williams's classic musical themes drawn from earlier Star Wars films throughout the cut. Joe George of Den of Geeks suggested the finished film had genuine potential to serve as a crowd-pleasing course correction for the broader franchise, capable of finally washing away some of the lingering audience fatigue left over from the divisive reception to The Rise of Skywalker several years earlier, provided Favreau was ultimately able to successfully knit together the many disparate tone and narrative elements glimpsed piecemeal across the trailer into a coherent whole. George specifically singled out the return of the beloved Ancelon characters as a particular highlight worth anticipating. William Hughes of the AV Club likewise pointed to the Angelans and to Weaver's overall screen presence as two especially strong selling points, capable of drawing in more casual moviegoers who hadn't necessarily watched a single episode of the underlying television series. Later that same month, Pascal and Favreau made surprise, unannounced appearances at CCXP Mexico, a major Latin American entertainment convention, where they screened the film's opening minutes for an enthusiastic and visibly emotional convention crowd. In May 2026, in the final stretch of promotion before the film's wide release, Disney's marketing arm posted a social media video showing Pascal dressed in full costume as the Mandalorian, apparently surprising a group of fans at the Star Wars Galaxy's Edge themed land located inside Disneyland in California. The stunt drew a substantial wave of negative online reaction almost immediately once it emerged publicly that the surprised fans featured prominently throughout the video were not simply random park guests encountered by chance, but rather a curated group of Star Wars focused content creators and social media influencers who had been specifically identified and invited to attend the event in advance by Disney's marketing team. James Hibbard later reported, following his own additional inquiry into the matter, that the individuals actually involved were genuine, longtime fans of the franchise with relatively modest social media followings rather than major established influencers, and that they had explicitly not been told in advance that Pascal himself would be the one making the surprise appearance. Hibbard also noted that Pascal, along with Weaver, Favreau, and Filoni, spent considerable additional time afterward interacting informally and unscripted with ordinary park visitors once the officially filmed portion of the promotional stunt had wrapped for the day. Even with those additional clarifying details later reported, the initial perception that Disney had artificially staged an authentic, spontaneous fan encounter using pre-selected content creators became a notable, if ultimately relatively minor, point of controversy during the final weeks before the film's release. Separately, industry reporting around the same period placed the film's combined production and marketing spend at roughly $300 million total, a figure that folded together the film's underlying theatrical production budget with the extensive multi-year promotional campaign described across the preceding paragraphs. home media ace of the period immediately surrounding the film's theatrical run, Disney had not publicly detailed a specific confirmed schedule for the film's eventual transition to digital purchase. Physical home media formats such as Blu-ray or 4K Ultra HD disc or streaming availability on the Disney Plus platform, where the television series that inspired it continues to be available. Studio home entertainment plans for major theatrical releases are typically announced closer to the tail end of a film's active theatrical window, once box office performance trends and overall theatrical run length have become considerably clearer to studio planners, and no formally confirmed dates for any of these subsequent release windows had been announced for The Mandalorian and Grogu as of the most recent available reporting on the production. Given the film's status as a major Lucasfilm and Disney theatrical release operating within the broader Disney distribution ecosystem, general industry expectation tends to follow the pattern set by the studio's other recent blockbuster theatrical titles, which have typically arrived for digital purchase within a period of a few months following their initial theatrical debut, before subsequently reaching the Disney Plus streaming platform and physical retail formats somewhat later. Still, no official confirmation of that specific timeline had been issued by the studio for this particular film. As of the most recent reporting available, however, leaving the precise home media rollout schedule an open question for interested audiences at that stage. For a franchise with as extensive a home entertainment history as Star Wars, the eventual arrival of The Mandalorian and Grogu on disc and on Disney Plus is likely to be treated by the studio as its own distinct marketing moment further down the line. Much as previous saga and spin-off releases have often been accompanied by bonus features, behind-the-scenes documentary content, and deleted or extended scenes highlighting the extensive practical puppetry and stop-motion work contributed by Tippett Studio during production. Until such plans are formally announced, however, the film's home media future remains defined largely by industry pattern and precedent rather than by any confirmed studio statement. Reception box office sales of May 31, 2026, roughly a week and a half into its theatrical run, Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu had grossed approximately $136.8 million across the United States and Canada, combined with an additional $110.1 million generated from international markets outside North America, for a combined worldwide total of $246.9 million. Pre-release box office tracking and analyst projections had initially forecast a considerably more modest opening weekend than the film ultimately went on to achieve once it actually reached theaters. In the domestic North American market specifically, industry analysts projected ahead of release that the film would open to somewhere around $82 million across a wide release footprint of roughly 4,300 theaters over its 4-day opening frame, including dedicated screenings at 425 separate IMAX locations nationwide. That relatively conservative projection would have represented the softest opening weekend for any Disney-era Star Wars theatrical release since the company's landmark 2012 acquisition of Lucasfilm, a comparison that several outlets noted carried real symbolic weight for a franchise still working to re-establish its box office footing. Globally, early expectations at that same stage placed the film's total opening weekend performance at a minimum of around $160 million once combined international markets were factored in alongside the domestic total. The gap between pre-release tracking and the film's eventual performance drew its own share of commentary from trade reporters covering the release, some of whom noted that tracking projections for major franchise films had grown increasingly difficult to calibrate accurately in the years following the disruptions to theatrical moviegoing habits earlier in the decade, with audiences for legacy franchise titles proving harder to predict in advance than they had been during the years immediately following Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm. The film's 4-day Memorial Day weekend release window was itself a familiar strategy for the franchise, echoing the timing previously used for Solo, a Star Wars story, in 2018, a scheduling choice intended to take advantage of the additional holiday moviegoing day, even as it also invited direct box office comparisons to that earlier release once final numbers were tallied. Those initial projections proved notably conservative once actual box office returns began coming in following the film's release. The film ultimately earned roughly $33 million on its opening day alone, a total that included approximately $12 million generated specifically from Thursday night preview screenings held ahead of the official wide release the following day. That stronger than anticipated start prompted box office analysts to revise their weekend projections meaningfully upward, moving into a range of $91 million to $96 million for the full opening weekend based on the early Thursday and Friday numbers. The film's trajectory across its first several days in theaters proved somewhat uneven, however. Box office tracking services noted a comparatively soft overall Friday performance before the film staged a significant rebound the following day, posting major single day box office gains on Saturday that ultimately pushed its cumulative domestic haul well past the initial post Thursday forecasts. By the close of its full 4-day opening period, the film had earned a total of $98.1 million domestically with $81. $7 million of that overall total generated specifically across the more traditional Friday through Sunday 3-day frame typically used for standard weekend comparisons across the industry. Despite comfortably topping the North American box office chart for the weekend against all other releases in theaters at the time, that final result nonetheless represented the lowest opening weekend performance recorded by any film in the Star Wars franchise since 2018's Solo, a Star Wars story, a direct comparison that several entertainment trade outlets highlighted prominently as evidence that the franchise was still working to fully use box office momentum it had once commanded during the peak years, immediately following Disney's original acquisition of Lucasfilm and the subsequent release of The Force Awakens Us. Critical reaction to The Mandalorian and Grogu proved sharply and persistently divided from the very outset of the review cycle, a split that continued to characterize the overall critical conversation rather than meaningfully narrowing as additional reviews from a wider range of outlets and individual critics continued to roll in over subsequent days. On the widely referenced review aggregation platform Rotten Tomatoes, 62% of 277 separately tracked critic reviews were classified as positive overall, translating to an average numerical score of 5.9 out of a possible 10 across all counted reviews. The site's official critical consensus summary described the film as heavy on action content, but comparatively thin in terms of underlying narrative substance, characterizing its somewhat episodic structure as functioning more like a minor skirmish than a fully realized standalone cinematic story in its own right. while nonetheless acknowledging that the film largely succeeds at coasting on the considerable charm and established chemistry of its central pairing of Din Djarin and Grogu. On Metacritic, a competing aggregator which calculates a weighted average score across included reviews rather than simply tallying a raw positive versus negative percentage. The film received an overall rating of 53 out of 100 based on 53 separate critic reviews factored into that calculation. A numerical range, the site's own classification system labels as indicating mixed or average reviews rather than a clearly positive or negative overall reception. Audience reaction, somewhat notably, skewed considerably more positive than the professional critical consensus described above. Moviegoers surveyed via the industry standard cinema score exit polling system gave the finished film an average grade of A minus on the service's letter grade scale, running from A plus down to F, a comfortably strong score generally associated with films that deliver successfully on audience expectations, regardless of how professional critics ultimately assessed the same material. Separately, 71% of audiences surveyed by the competing post-track exit polling service indicated they would definitely recommend the film to friends or family, a figure generally regarded within the industry as a solid, if not overwhelming, word-of-mouth indicator for a major theatrical release. The overall shape of the broader critical conversation surrounding the film centered on a fairly consistent, recurring set of praised and criticized elements across the majority of published reviews. Reviewers across a wide range of outlets frequently singled out Pedro Pascal's central performance, the continued and seemingly undiminished charm of the Grogu character specifically, and Ludwig Göransson's musical score as the film's clearest and most consistently praised assets, while directing more sustained criticism toward the film's large-scale action sequence and overall visual execution, elements which several critics felt fell noticeably short of what audiences have generally come to expect from a full theatrical Star Wars release, as opposed to a comparatively lower budget television episode. Coverage aggregating the earliest wave of published reviews ahead of the wide release described the overall critical response as genuinely split between viewers who embraced the film wholeheartedly as a fun, satisfying and largely self-contained adventure, buoyed significantly by Pascal's characteristically understated performance and Goransson's dynamic and emotionally resonant musical work, with the film's snowy opening action sequence frequently singled out and cited by multiple critics as a particular high point of the entire runtime, set against a competing group of detractors who argued the finished film felt broadly unworthy of the wider franchise's decades-long cinematic legacy, pointing specifically to comparatively low overall narrative stakes, underdeveloped supporting characters, including both Jeremy Allen White's performance as Rota and Sigourney Weaver's performance as Colonel Ward, and large-scale action sequences that several reviewers felt leaned too heavily on digital visual effects, work at the direct expense of genuine tension, spatial clarity, or emotional stakes within individual set pieces. Other early review roundups published around the same time described a broadly similar underlying pattern among critics. Some found the finished film to be genuinely fun and visually engaging overall, despite leaning on a fairly familiar franchise story beats throughout, while others felt the same material landed as emotionally flat, narratively predictable, and generally unremarkable when measured against the standards typically expected of a major theatrical tentpole release. A recurring and frequently repeated observation across numerous outlets covering the film's reception was the sense that the finished movie often played less like a fully self contained theatrical cinematic event in its own right and more like an unusually well produced extended episode of the television series. It had originally been spun off from an assessment that was offered both as a pointed piece of direct criticism by some individual writers and by other critics covering the same film as a considerably more neutral and largely descriptive characterization of the film's essential underlying nature rather than a value judgment in either direction. Individual published reviews illustrated just how far apart different critics ultimately landed on their overall assessment of the finished film. Giovanni Lago, writing for the outlet Next Best Picture, argued bluntly that nothing about the finished film genuinely justified its theatrical presentation on premium large format IMAX screens, specifically describing Pascal's overall performance throughout as noticeably subdued and somewhat half hearted, while separately suggesting that Jeremy Allen White had similarly been given comparatively little substantive material to work with in terms of actual dialogue for his voice performance as Rota. Jermaine Lucier of Gizmodo offered a broadly comparable and similarly unenthusiastic overall assessment of the finished movie, writing plainly that the film ultimately fails to meaningfully advance either its central characters or the broader ongoing Star Wars franchise into genuinely new creative or narrative territory beyond what audiences had already seen across the preceding television series. Clarice Laufrey of The Independent emerged as among the most sharply critical individual voices across the entire published review cycle, arguing that between Pascal's comparatively limited amount of screen time throughout the finished runtime and a voice performance from White that she personally found largely lifeless and dispirited overall, the finished film ranked among the most genuinely inconsequential and forgettable entries the wider franchise had yet produced across its many decades of releases. Other published reviews landed in somewhat more measured, if still ultimately largely unconvinced, critical territory overall. Liz Shannon Miller, reviewing the film for the outlet Consequence, awarded the finished movie a B letter grade overall, while simultaneously suggesting that despite a number of genuinely compelling news stories having emerged elsewhere across the broader Star Wars universe in the years since the release of The Rise of Skywalker, the specific experience of watching this particular story unfold, which she personally likened at one point to a space set variation on the classic samurai narrative Lone Wolf and Cub, mainly served to reinforce her own broader sense that the franchise's ongoing theatrical output was, in her assessment, largely treading water creatively rather than pushing meaningfully forward. Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian felt the finished film ultimately lacked sufficient warmth, genuine humor, and the distinctive sense of grand, extravagant space melodrama that has historically defined much of what makes the wider Star Wars franchise so consistently appealing to its enormous global audience across generations. Frank Sheck of The Hollywood Reporter described the film's underlying storyline and thematic ambitions as surprisingly modest and comparatively small in scale given the considerable overall size, budget, and marketing scope of the production surrounding it. Tom Jorgensen of IGN suggested in his own review that the finished film seemed rather narrowly tailored specifically to appeal to casual viewers who had only a passing second-hand familiarity with the underlying television series rather than to long-time devoted fans of the broader Star Wars saga more generally. Several critics also situated their reviews within the broader context of Lucasfilm's post-2019 theatrical output or lack thereof, noting that the gap of several years since the rise of Skywalker had left the studio with limited recent theatrical precedent against which to measure the new film. For some reviewers, that absence of a recent comparison point made The Mandalorian and Grogu feel like a lower stakes reintroduction of the brand to cinemas, closer in spirit to Filoni's own description of the project as a celebratory victory lap rather than a bold new creative statement. For others, that same absence became a point of frustration, with several critics arguing that a franchise returning to theaters after such a long absence owed audiences something more ambitious than a story that, as multiple reviewers noted, could plausibly have been told across a handful of television episodes. Instead, not every published review skewed toward the negative end of the spectrum. However, and a meaningful contingent of individual critics ultimately pushed back quite forcefully against some of the more dismissive assessments circulating elsewhere in the broader review cycle. Eric Kane of Forbes described the finished film in considerably more enthusiastic terms as an outright blast to watch, and directly engaged in his own review with the recurring critical argument raised repeatedly by other reviewers that the underlying story might have worked comparably well or even better had it instead been produced as a full fourth season of the television series rather than condensed into a single feature film. Kane contended in response that a full television season format would likely have diluted the core story considerably with unnecessary narrative filler simply to stretch the material out across a complete season's total runtime, and that condensing the same underlying story into a single feature film instead allowed for a considerably more tightly constructed set of genuinely memorable cinematic moments throughout, moments that, crucially in his assessment, audiences also ultimately got to experience together collectively in a shared theatrical setting rather than watching alone at home across a period of many separate weeks. He expressed clear personal satisfaction overall that Lucasfilm had ultimately chosen to pursue the theatrical feature film route rather than continuing to develop the project as an ongoing television series. Taken together across the full range of published critical reactions, the overall reception to The Mandalorian and Grogu reflected a franchise still visibly navigating an uncertain creative and commercial position, several years removed from the conclusion of its original core 9-film saga back in 2019. While the film's central creative partnership, Pascal's performance as Din Djarin alongside the puppeteered, digitally enhanced character of Grogu, continued to draw remarkably consistent praise across nearly every published review as the clear emotional backbone of the entire story. And Garonson's musical score was likewise widely regarded across the board as one of the production's unambiguous creative successes. The broader narrative construction and overall visual execution of the finished film left individual critics genuinely divided in a way that closely mirrored, and in certain specific cases even explicitly echoed, long-running debates already well established within the wider Star Wars fan community regarding the franchise's overall creative direction under Disney's continued stewardship. The film's ultimate box office performance a chart-topping opening weekend that nonetheless simultaneously represented the single softest debut recorded by the franchise in nearly a decade, appeared in many respects to reflect that very same underlying audience ambivalence, even as the specific segment of the audience that did ultimately turn out to see the film in theaters reported considerably higher overall satisfaction levels than the more mixed professional critical consensus alone would otherwise tend to suggest.